Hi Nolan, how you doing? Everything fine on your end?
I love my life, Robin. How about you?
I think nobody ever greeted me like that. I love my life, but
Well,
but
we're
you love your
Bitcoiners.
life because of
What are we
Bitcoin.
doing? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. How can you not, as a Bitcoiner, love your life right now? Things are going great. Who can complain? It's not possible, right? We're kicking ass. We're kicking ass and taking names.
What do you mean with we're kicking ass in general, or is there like something specific that makes you bullish?
Well, seeing what's happening in America, watching America readjust itself to Bitcoin so that Bitcoin fits in America is enough to make any American optimistic. It's sort of spreading around the country. It's pushing on borders, right? There's this idea that you look at the chaos in the world and you ask, is Bitcoin conforming or finding a place in the chaos? In many ways, Bitcoin's creating the chaos. And you're in Europe, and you got the European Central Bank, and now you got these trade wars beginning with America. Of course, this is something that could benefit America and Bitcoin. America couldn't do what it's currently doing with Europe and altering these relationships if it wasn't for Bitcoin, if it wasn't for a new financial system emerging. So I think we advanced very quickly with what Michael Saylor is doing, with what Bitcoin Magazine did with getting Trump involved in Bitcoin back in 2024 in the summer, and just watching Bitcoin reshape everything through America right now is, I think, the most. Bitcoin has always been the most interesting story in finance. That finance part is really spilling over into kinetic relationships between nation states, between the configuration of the world. So it's all bullish as far as I'm concerned.
How big is it for you that Trump is? I'm cautious with saying he's a Bitcoiner, but let's say with Trump being in Bitcoin,
How big is it for me personally? For
yeah, like
well,
the
it's an it was a lonely place. As you're probably aware, being a Bitcoiner has a certain loneliness factor to it, right? There's once you start grokking Bitcoin and understanding Bitcoin, relationships change with before it's a sort of before Bitcoin, before Christ type situation. You can measure time in it. I'm still close with my dear friends that I grew up with, but Bitcoin creates a type of estrangement in some ways. Once your worldview is based on Bitcoin, and once you start seeing the world with Bitcoin eyes, there's a kind of loneliness factor in America. That was also true with being a Trump supporter back in 2015. I'm an original Bitcoin 2015 long Bitcoin long Trump, and that was a very lonely place for many people in America to be that. To be one of those people was not easy. And for that to change now, and that you don't have to mix your words, you can add Trump to toxic maximalism. Do you know how much fun that is to be able to trigger liberal people in America with both Trump and Bitcoin at the same time? You know how much excitement this is? It's like it's an injection of toxicity into the toxic Bitcoin maximalists. That it's like the mutant super serum or something. It just absolutely turns you into extra bonus toxic. So that's fun.
you also said something interesting. You said Bitcoin is creating chaos. What do you mean by that?
Well, just look at what Trump can do. Look at Canada, for example. I'm Canadian as well, and in Canada, right? The look at the truckers thing that happened in 2022. When the truckers thing happened, of course, the new prime minister, Mark Carney, was the governor of the Bank of England, was the governor of the Bank of Canada. I used to work. He used to have to report to my committee twice a year to give his economic update. I used to work for the Senate Banking Committee in Canada. And so he would come, and I know him. I've hung out with him many times. I used to write him to invite him to Bitcoin events regularly. He never came. I actually have fun staying poured him one time when he said no to an event because he had a book coming out, and I was producing a CoinDesk event in the pandemic, and it just so happened that the CoinDesk event was the same day as his book launch, Values with an S in parentheses, values. He's such a good person. He's so great. And he said, "Oh, I can't make it." And I said, "Well, HFSP, have fun." I don't think he understood what I meant, obviously. But then he's the guy in Canada that came ahead and told Bitcoiners and wrote an op-ed in the truckers' protest back in 2022 to follow the money. His actual headline was "Follow the Money, Stop the Protests by Using Martial Law to Go After Political Dissidents," or whatever you want to call it, to go after political people. And now there was a thought at the time. I did the math when this happened against the Bank of Canada, and I said, well, what happens? What would happen if Bitcoiners globally got together and shorted the Canadian dollar? What would happen? And I did the math. I found out Canada had about $50 billion in reserves, exactly what the Bank of England had when George Soros broke their back. And I found out the mechanisms by which George Soros did it. It was a $10 billion short on top of their $50 billion, 50 billion trash token, Canadian trash tokens in reserve. And in the case of Bank of England, it took 500 basis points, so full 5% increase in the interest rate, and all of the reserves were spent. So I said, we could the global Bitcoiners who have figured out all this stuff, shorting, Forex, everything, we could probably muster a $10 billion short and get a run on the Canadian dollar. Now, the problem back then was they would have used their Fed swap line to just re-inject the money. So Bitcoin could have taken a punch, could have delivered a punch to the Bank of Canada and the Canadian dollar. The Bank of Canada and the Canadian dollar would have fallen, but the next day the Federal Reserve would have bailed them out. With what's going on now between Trump and Canada and the United States and the trade war, there ain't no Fed Reserve coming to bail out Canada if Bitcoiners decide to take a knock at a pretending trash token and wipe it off the face of the earth. They don't have any gold. They don't have any of this stuff. Canada has been tricked. I often use, you're an Austrian school guy, not just an Austrian, but an Austrian school guy. And we, of course, understand money in psychological terms, right? It's not about the numbers. There's numbers involved, but math has nothing to do with it. This is not a math game, right? This is a psychological game. And the Canadian psychology has been so mixed with US psychology that it can't tell the difference. But when you actually bring out the money, then it becomes, there's a difference. Canada can't behave as if its money is a global reserve currency. And just because it had these advantages of swap lines with the Federal Reserve, where they could get free injections of capital, whatever they needed in terms of US dollars to shore up their bank, that's gone. And so if, for example, a bunch of degenerate Bitcoiners want to make money and decide to literally bet against the Bank of Canada, which I think is a good bet, you'll make money and you'll actually, create chaos in Canada. I don't think Canada survives any of this. I think Canada's finished. I think it's over. I think it can't survive. It can't survive for a million reasons, but in the end, it will be Bitcoin that ties the bow for people to understand why Canada can't survive. And so that's chaos. That's pure chaos right there.
And you have in your Twitter banner, I love that, like the fiat apocalypse. Basically, is that kind of the beginning stages of what we see there?
Yeah, I think so. And that's, apocalypse just means the end of time. And time, of course, is money. We understand that as Bitcoiners. Some people call Bitcoin the time chain. Time 100%, the old colloquialism go. I don't know if such a thing exists in the German language, but I know in English, time is money. We're all convinced time is money. And it seems true and it feels true. And they're both finite resources. We spend them on things, and whether they're useful or not. It is the end of one time when it comes to the fiat apocalypse. And I think so. I think that Canada has been kept together using fiat trickery. And again, go back to the psychological engine piece that an economy really is. I use the word psychological engine as a proxy for economy. I think that economics, I think they're the same thing. And the Canadian psychological engine has sputtered along for a long time using types of manipulation that have set it up to fail. More or less, Canada uses a taxation power to shift money from different places in the country. My home state of Quebec is one of the richest states in the world. We've got 600 billion Canadian trash tokens, sovereign wealth fund. and 39 gigawatts of electricity available at our disposal because of our hydroelectric dams. We have a nuclear reactor we run for fun. We don't even have it plugged into the grid. And it's to sell nuclear reactors to other areas. So we create a reactor that Korea bought for many years and now copies and knows how to make themselves. But that was a market of export for Canada. We could export nuclear reactors, and we're very good at building them. But the way Quebec screwed the rest of Canada, and I'm a proud Quebecer. I love my home state, so this is no criticism of my home state and my home province of Quebec. It's more that what happened was we made a deal where our hydroelectricity doesn't actually count in our GDP, and when they make this transfer of money between the country, it's based on GDP numbers. So imagine, we understand energy is the economy. Bitcoiners understand energy is the most important factor in an economy. It's the most important factor in this psychological engine to get an economy to perpetuate forward. If you have a lot of energy, if you're Texas, you can be stupid and make mistakes, and it doesn't really matter because you have enough electricity. If you're in Quebec, you can be a socialist country, and it doesn't really matter because you have so much electricity that you can pay for the excess. You know, a place like Germany that I saw yesterday demolished a 6-year-old coal power plant because Greta wasn't happy about it is not a good sign for their psychological state. But what kept Canada together was, Alberta didn't get to subtract its oil resources from this equation. So Alberta actually sends that money over to Quebec every year, about 14 billion Canadian trash tokens a year, in order to subsidize Quebec staying in the Federation. So I learned at a time when my state, when I was a young man, tried to separate from Canada, and the vote was so close. It was 50.3 to 49.7 to stay in Canada at the time. And the excuse or the blame that the separatist powers gave, the sovereignist powers of Quebec gave, it was money. Money is what did it. The Bank of Canada is what did it. The bank and the economic threats, the psychological threats to your bank account, to your bottom line. Literally, a man with guns argument was made by Canada by saying, you're not going to be able to use our money. And how are they going to stop that? How are they going to stop Quebecers from using the Canadian dollar those, 20, 30 years ago? The answer was, you had to use your imagination, but at a certain point, they had to go into people's bank accounts and homes to take out their Canadian dollars, and that was getting sketchy. But it's what worked. That fear mongering worked. Now, without a Bank of Canada, without that institution, there's nothing that will keep the country together, and so it will break apart.
Is that ultimately where Bitcoin leads every country, decentralizing the power of it and making it shrink?
Well, I think so. The United States would be the exception to the rule, because the United States was formed as a decentralized agreement to begin with. The United States Protocol, the real original protocol of the US Constitution, underlined that each of those individual states were sovereign countries to themselves that shared very few competencies. Now, war and the finance of war is what altered our linguistic understanding of America. It actually went down to our operating protocol of English and how we ran that in America. It's a very simple formula, though. If you look at America after the Revolutionary War in 1776 and up to the US Civil War in 1860, the way you would have described America in the English language is you would have said the United States are. You would have said that. You'd have said the United States are. You'd have used a plural to be verb. You would conjugate it plural. After the US Civil War in 1860, you started to say the United States is. From then on, you thought of it as a unified sovereign state, not a state comprised of many individual sovereign states. You would have said these United States are, and then you started to say the United States is after that. So the Civil War had this big linguistic effect, really because it was all an exercise in war finance. Now this goes up right up to the Second World War. Up until the Second World War, you would have easily said the United States are. I'm having internet troubles for some reason here. I hope I'm coming through well. Normally I don't.
Oh, yeah, I hear you good. I hear you good. Yeah, I think it's fine.
So after the Second World War, what you started to hear was the federal government is. You even got away from the idea of plurality in the United States. You'd just hear the Fed is, the federal government is, the Fed is, the federal government, the U.S., the Washington D.C. is. Now, all of that was created. Everything America did to win World War II they basically never shut off. They kept the aircraft carriers running. They kept the institutions that were built, the Washington, D.C. institutions that were built in order to win World War II. What we're really going through here in World War III is a psychological and economic war. I don't think it's very kinetic. It's got some, don't tell that to the Ukrainians and the Russians and other people. Of course, there is moments of kinetic warfare going on. I would say even Tesla dealerships have become a location of kinetic warfare right now in America. So there's definitely some kinetic aspects to World War III, but in general, the right way, or the way I think about it, is as an economic and psychological war. We see it with the USAID persuasion stuff. We see it with the nudging. We see with the psyops. We see with the sophisticated manner in which propaganda is spread around, and money is behind that. If you follow the money, you'll get a better sense of what the fault lines of World War III are. Now, most nations that fall under this, that fall outside of the United States system, don't have this fallback of decentralized organization to go into. Now, what I do believe is going to happen is that other states are going to join the United States going forward, and they're going to bring a reinvigoration of sovereign ideas to each individual state. So when I just mentioned that Alberta, there will be a 51st state, and it will be in Canada. Canada is not, you can't add Canada as a 51st state, but you can add pieces of Canada as a 51st state to the United States. So when Alberta, with the fourth largest oil reserves in the world, Alberta being a landlocked state requires a good neighbor. Canada ain't it. Everything I just explained about the federal transfer of money, and they're not building them any pipelines. They're not doing anything for them. Right? They're on their own. Trump is going to build them a pipeline. He's going to build them the Keystone XL pipeline, and that's going to bring about 1 million barrels of oil a day. So Canada right now is being held together. The whole ability to keep Canada together comes down to about 2 million people in the state of Alberta. The state of Alberta, not much bigger than Austria, maybe 5 million people total. Not a huge place. Any referendum that happens there would have to take into account the transfer payments. They want to make more money. They need a port to get their product out to market. You got a ton of Bitcoin mining there happening simply because they can't get their product out, but they do want to get their product out. And they have, like I said, just an unbelievable amount and supply of this stuff to get out of the ground, but nowhere to put it. So eventually what I think you'll see is a state like Alberta can join the American Union, but not as one that's going to join every federal institution in Washington, D.C. It's actually going to bring a counterforce, a decentralizing force, a reinvigoration of decentralization and sovereign state consciousness to the United States Union. And that will allow for more participants to join. You're going to have a great increase in what the United States of America are. I could imagine a place like El Salvador even joining the United States of America in a very loose coalition. So it's a bit of a choke on the bone situation, right? America absorbs new states, and a bit like what happened with China reabsorbing Hong Kong. Be careful what you wish for, because you got a bunch of new people in your country in the case of China, but they're not the same as the ones you've had there already. They're bringing something else, and that will affect the whole. And I could see Alberta, who's got a lot to offer the United States when it comes to negotiating entry as a 51st state. I think they're going to get a sweet deal. And I think that deal, for example, I think it's going to exempt them from IRS oversight. All kinds of weird things are going to happen. And then I know Americans, right? They're going to say, well, I want that too. They're going to be jealous. And it's going to create a whole new consciousness. So I do imagine that when we hear the United States, we went from the United States are, the United States is, the United States are, the Fed is, I think we're going to go full circle, and World War III will be over linguistically when people start saying the United States are again, and we start having a lot more state level sovereignty, state level consciousness erupt. And because it's more about affiliate groups of like-minded people, Bitcoiners are becoming a nation inside of America. We're becoming a separate people inside of America because we see things this way. We've got cultural hubs all across America now. We've got MicroStrategy opening its own Bitcoin studio and cultural hub in Washington, D.C. We've got PubKey in New York. We've got the Bitcoin Commons. We've got one in San Francisco. This stuff is going to continue to be, I think, a big trendsetter when it comes to public debate, content, the ability to move the needle, move the narrative, coalesce around Bitcoin culture, which will continue to spread outwards. It'll affect the grid. It's going to affect farming. It's going to affect health. It's going to affect every aspect of America.
Thank you for watching this video. This was only a snippet of the podcast. And if you want to watch the full episode and get all of the context of this episode, you can click right here or here. Oh, maybe also here.